Okay, welcome to our third video where we're discussing philosophical or ethical arguments about abortion. In the first video, we discussed how to define abortion, and we worked through three different definitions and settled on the definition that an abortion is often an intentional killing of a fetus to end a pregnancy. In the next video, we discussed some question-begging arguments, and question-begging arguments are arguments where the reason given in favor of the conclusion just assumes that conclusion. So it's a type of circular reasoning. So in this video, we're going to talk about what I call everyday arguments. And these are just kind of common arguments that you hear or read, and they're not really arguments discussed by philosophers, but they're very common arguments, and we need to think about them a little bit before we get to the philosophical arguments. So here's a few that we'll look at. Abortion's wrong because fetuses are alive, they're life, they're human. The Bible says abortion's wrong. And there's also many other arguments that we can talk about. And on the flip side, we'll look at some arguments that abortion is not wrong because they're not alive, they're not human. And then these other claims about women have a right to do what they want with their bodies and men should have no say on these issues. And abortion critics just want to control women, and there are many other arguments that we could and should talk about also. So, little reminder, all this is from the open access book, Thinking Critically About Abortion. There are many more everyday arguments discussed there, and you can get that book here. So, another reminder, we have these two questions that we'll be asking over and over again. What do you think? No, not what do you think. Why think that, and what do you mean? And these will be especially important in thinking about these arguments. So about the why think that question, let me give you a little bit of Aristotle. Aristotle observed that reasoning often comes in this form, which is called a syllogism. And basically what this says is, here's a standard example. Socrates is mortal. Why is that? Well, Socrates is a man. All men are mortal, so therefore Socrates is mortal. So what this equation on the right represents, it says this thing, A is Q, and why should you think A is Q? Well, because A is P, and the next line says anything that's P is also Q. And we'll see this formula is very helpful in thinking about lots of arguments. So, the first argument for the conclusion that fetuses are wrong to kill, that abortion is wrong, is the claim that fetuses are alive. So there's this common question like, when does life begin? And there's the thought that this is a really profound question, and it's a hard one to answer. But I think maybe this is a hard question to answer because people don't try to define life. Because if you define life, it seems like it's a pretty easy question to answer. You know, if by life you mean like biological life or being biologically living, then yeah, of course fetuses are biologically living. So I have the argument written up here as a syllogism. And the first premise is definitely true. I mean, the topic of abortion is about killing fetuses, and you can't kill things that aren't alive. So yeah, fetuses are biologically alive, that's for sure. But how do you get from there to the conclusion that fetuses are wrong to kill? Well, we need to kind of follow our formula here. And you need to add a premise that says something like all biologically living things are wrong to kill. So take these two premises, you get to the conclusion that fetuses are wrong to kill. But the second premise just isn't true. Here I have some examples of some plants, some mold, some mosquitoes. These are biologically living things. Are they wrong to kill? No, not at all. They're not even what's called like prima facie wrong to kill. The prima facie is a phrase that philosophers use, which basically means like if you say something's prima facie wrong to kill, we'd say, well, you're wrong to kill unless there's a really good reason to do so. So most of us would want to say we are prima facie wrong to kill. There could be some unfortunate circumstances where it could be okay to kill us. We hope to never be in those circumstances. But if we're not in one of those circumstances, it would be wrong to kill us. So is mold and vegetables, are they prima facie wrong to kill? Most people are going to say no. You don't need some excellent reason to kill some mold. So there's this obsession about when life begins, but if by life you mean biological life, then yeah, fetuses are definitely biologically alive, but just because something's biologically alive doesn't make it wrong to kill. Now, somebody might mean something different by life, and we will talk about that later. Um, all right, next argument. There's this question, are fetuses human? And the thought is, if they're human, well, then abortion would be wrong. Well, again, we have to ask, what do you mean human? So you could mean biologically human. What's this mean? Like having human DNA, being of the human species, things like that. Um, well, if we're thinking about fetuses in human women, then yeah, these fetuses are biologically human. We could be thinking about aborting cats or aborting dogs or something like that, but we're not thinking about that. So yeah, fetuses are definitely biologically human. But to get to the conclusion that they're wrong to kill, or even prima facie wrong to kill, you need to think like all biologically human things are wrong to kill. Um, and I have a picture here of some human cells in a petri dish. Here's the question: would it be wrong to kill these cells on this dish? Um, Typical answer would be no, that wouldn't be wrong. However, these cells are biologically human. So what does this mean? Well, if since these cells are biologically human and they're not wrong to kill, they're not prima facie wrong to kill, don't need some great reason to kill these cells, that suggests that premise 2 is false. So there's this big obsession about whether fetuses are human or not, but if you mean biologically human, definitely they're biologically human. But since premise 2 is false, that means just because something's biologically human, that doesn't mean it's wrong to kill it. So again, maybe the response here is maybe people mean something different by human, and if so, we need to figure that out. All right, next. There about many moral issues, people give arguments from the Bible, or at least in some cultures, people give arguments from the Bible. And here's two arguments about the ethics and legality about abortion. And I'm not going to say anything about these arguments other than I suspect probably many people are going to think that for each of these arguments, at least one of these premises isn't really true. So there's a lot of discussion out there about religious traditions, religious texts, and abortion, the relationship between law and religion. And I'm just going to leave it at that and say I think probably most people, if you put it as bold as this, they don't quite think that all these premises are true. So, other arguments. Moving to the other side, things that people say to think that abortion is not wrong. Well, sometimes you hear people say fetuses aren't even human. Well, um, if by biologically human, if that's what you mean by human, yeah, they're definitely biologically human. So that needs to be clarified. People sometimes say fetuses aren't even alive. And yeah, of course, they're biologically alive. And again, maybe by human or alive, they mean something different, but we need to clarify what that means. People sometimes say, or I sometimes hear people say, like, well, fetuses are dependent on the woman, and so she can do whatever she wants. Well, the unstated assumption here, or the premise that we would have to add to turn this into a syllogism, is something like, well, if someone is dependent on someone or something else, then it's okay to kill them or let them die. And it seems like that's just not a true premise. You could be hooked up to life support, um, all sorts of situations where just because you're dependent on somebody else doesn't make it okay to end your life. Finally, or not finally, but people sometimes say that, look, abortion's not wrong because women and girls will die if abortion isn't allowed. And it's worthwhile to try to figure out whether that's true or not, or the extent to which that is true or not. But on the what we want to do is formulate the argument in the complete form as a syllogism if we can, so the full reasoning is there. But we have this to get from that claim to therefore abortion's wrong. You have to think that, well, if people will die if doing something isn't allowed, then doing that something is okay. And it seems like that is a dubious premise. It could be that, well, I'm just going to leave it open-ended and ask, can you think of things that if we didn't allow these things being done, people would die, but you think that would be wrong? If so, this might not be a great argument to think that abortion's not wrong. Okay, more arguments that you might hear or that you often hear like every day. Women have a right to do whatever they want with their bodies. Well, in reply, they don't have a right to do anything and everything they want. So that seems to be false if that's what's being said. Maybe this is also kind of a question-begging argument. We've talked about these before. But what's important is it's just not true that women have a right to do whatever they want with their bodies. People sometimes say, look, abortion's not wrong because, well, men shouldn't talk about this issue. Men should have no opinions here. This is something that people say. Well, in reply, it's worth noticing that, women disagree on this issue. And I think basically the division on this issue is mostly kind of equal by the genders. But also, to think about the full structure of the argument, we need to ask if this is true. If men believe or argue something on a topic, then their views must be false or their arguments unsound. Is that true? No. So I think if somebody were to think that somehow abortion's not wrong because of something that men say or don't say, and people do seem to kind of say these sorts of things, that just doesn't seem to be a good reason to think that abortion is not wrong. Finally, people sometimes say, look, abortion's not wrong because critics of abortion just want to control women. We talked about this a little bit in the question begging section. And this seems to be false. If people are being controlled, then they just aren't doing anything wrong. That does not seem to be true. And so, you could try to figure out whether the claim that abortion critics just want to control women or not. But however that turns out, if people are being controlled, that doesn't mean they're not doing something wrong. That's at least possible. So, I've been a little nitpicky about these sorts of things, but the point is that you hear a lot of arguments on these topics, and if you try to formulate them a little more rigorously, and this is a common useful pattern to do that, you might find that at least one premise of the reasoning is often not so good. So there are many more arguments that are discussed in the section on this type of argument in the book, and if you want to check those out, that would be great. All right, finally, in our next video, we're finally going to get to some philosophical arguments. And we've been working up to these arguments, but we've been working up to them because people say a lot of things about this issue, and we need to sort of address more common things that people say before we get to the more sophisticated arguments. So in the end, we'll think about some arguments that abortion's wrong because fetuses are human beings. It's not just that they're merely biologically human. There's a difference between being a human being and being merely biologically human. Next, we'll think about the claim that fetuses are persons, and so abortion's wrong. Next, we'll think about the claim that fetuses have valuable futures, and abortion deprives them of those valuable futures, and so abortion's wrong. And finally, a somewhat abstract argument that fetuses have a rational nature or essence, and so abortion's wrong. So we'll look at these arguments, which are the main philosophical arguments against abortion. And then on the other side, we'll look at an argument that basically says, well, we should think abortion is not wrong because the arguments given to think that it's wrong just aren't very good arguments. And then we will have some arguments that depend upon some facts about fetuses, such as that early fetuses have never been conscious, they're not conscious, they can't feel anything, and so they're not persons, they can't be harmed. And again, this argument depends upon facts about fetuses and fetuses' consciousness or lack of consciousness. And then finally, an argument that abortion is not wrong because fetuses do not have a right to the woman's body. So even if fetuses happen to be persons, even if they happen to have a right to life, fetuses don't have a right to the woman's body. So tune in for our next video for discussion of these more advanced arguments. Thank you.